The last Oblivion Gate threatening one of Cyrodiil's cities has been destroyed, and even Kvatch has sent help to Bruma. I really hope all my effort actually has meaning, or I just wasted a lot of time and my own safety for nothing. Bruma, however, should be safe from any other Oblivion Gate opening up around it for the time being. My focus will now be on Skingrad, though Vilya did ask for help, and that help will take me back to Haneri Hlalu in Shadenhall. Vilya has been such a good friend and a worthy companion that, even if I didn't care for her like I do, then I would still help her. She means a lot to me, though, so of course I will help her. But I have a book to read right now. This is one of my favorite books of all time, the story of the Imperial invasion of Akavir. It really allows my imagination to soar about what really went on over there, how the invasion failed, and what the Akaviri people are like. Unfortunately, they did invade Tamriel twice in the last 2 millennia. One could say that their first invasion didn't actually fail, it sort of merged with the new Imperial Empire that was started up under Riemann Cyrodiil. But I am curious as to the reasoning to why the Emperor chose to invade Akavir. The reasoning for this has never been given. To just up an attempt to conquer a people you know virtually nothing about, on another continent, with all the logistic and communication issues that they faced, seems rather absurd to me. However, we do know a little of the Akaviri snake people, as they formed the basis for the Blades, and they helped Riemann to conquer all of Tamriel, save Morrowind. Morrowind was unassailable due to the tribunal gods who protected them. The snake people have been described in some detail during their time here in Tamriel, but nothing of them is described in the book I'm about to read, which makes Akavir all the more mysterious. So the Guide to Skingrad, I do believe that I've already read through this. Yeah. Talks about Agnet the Pickled on the other side, and I know I've read that. So I don't need that book anymore. So I've read On Oblivion as well, I just need to read the Guide to Anvil. The report of the disastered Ionith is one of my favorite books, actually. It does go on for a little while. Report of the Imperial Commission on the disastered Ionith. Lord Potreed, Chairman. Part 1. Preparations. The Emperor's plans for the invasion of Akavir were laid in the 270s, when he began the conquest of the small island kingdoms that lie between Tamriel and Akavir. With the fall of Black Harbor and Esrionet in 282, Uriel V was already looking ahead to the ultimate prize. He immediately ordered extensive renovations to the port, which would serve as the marshalling point for the invasion force and as the main supply source throughout the campaign. At this time, he also began the construction of many large, ocean-going transports that would be needed for the final crossing to Akavir, in which the Navy was previously deficient. Thus, it can be seen that the Emperor's preparations for the invasion were laid well in advance, even before the conquest of Esrionet was complete, and was not a sudden whim, as some has charged. See, I find this all very odd, that you would think that he would send scouts, ships to explore, scouts making landings and contact with the inhabitants over there instead of just sending an invasion force. I guess they kind of had a rough estimate of the coast from previous scouting expeditions, but still. I mean, they weren't in contact. I've read this book several times. They weren't in contact with the inhabitants there. It's just they seemed to show up with their army and fleet and tried to take over. When Prince Bashaman yielded Esrionet to Imperial authority in 284, the Emperor's full attention could be devoted to planning for the Akaviri campaign. Naval expeditions were dispatched in 285 and 286, to scout the sea lanes and coastlands of Akavir, and various Imperial intelligence agents, both magical and mundane, were employed to gather information. On the basis of all of this was information. The King of Saeshi, in the southwest of Akavir, was selected as the initial target for the invasion, so why didn't they try to create some kind of diplomatic effort? If it is a kingdom. It just seems strange to me. Meanwhile, the Emperor was gathering his expeditionary force. A new Far East fleet was created for the campaign, which for a time dwarfed the rest of the navy. It is said to be the most powerful fleet ever assembled in the history of Tamriel. The 5th, 7th, 10th, and 14th legions were selected for the initial landing, with the 9th and 17th to follow as reinforcements once the beachhead was secured. While this may seem to the layman a relatively small fraction of the army's total manpower, It must be remembered that this expeditionary force would have to be maintained at the end of a long and tenuous supply line. In addition, the Emperor and the army command believed that the invasion would not be strongly imposed, at least at first. Perhaps most crucially, the Navy had only enough heavy transport capacity to move 4 legions at a time. That to me seems quite a bit, actually. It should be noted here that the Commission does not find fault with the Emperor's preparations for the invasion. Based on the information available prior to the invasion, which, while obviously deficient in hindsight, a great effort has been made to accumulate. The Commission believes that the Emperor did not act recklessly or imprudently. Some have argued that the expeditionary force was too small. The Commission believes that, on the contrary, even if shipping could have been found to transport and supply more legions, an impossibility without crippling the trade of the entire empire, this would have merely added to the scale of the disaster. It would not have averted it. Neither could the rest of the empire be denuded of legions. The memory of the Comoran usurper was still fresh, and the Emperor believed, and this commission agrees, that the security of the empire precluded a larger concentration of military force outside of Tamriel. If anything, the commission believes that the expeditionary force was too large. Despite the creation of 2 new legions during his reign, and the recreation of the 5th, the loss of the expeditionary force left the empire in a dangerously weak position relative to the provinces, as the current situation makes all too clear. This suggests that the invasion of Akavir was beyond the Empire's current strength. Even if the Emperor could have fielded and maintained a larger force in Akavir, the Empire may have disintegrated behind him. Part 2 of the invasion of Akavir. The expeditionary force left Black Harbor on 23rd Rain's Hand in 288, and with fair weather landed in Akavir after 6 weeks at sea. The landing site was a small Saeshi port at the mouth of a large river, chosen for its proximity to Tamriel as well as its location in a fertile river valley, giving easy access to the interior as well as good foraging for the army. All went well at first. The Saeshi had abandoned the town when the expeditionary force approached, so they took possession of it and renamed it Septimia, the first colony of the new imperial province of Akavir. While the engineers fortified the town and expanded the port facilities to serve the Far East fleet, the Emperor marched inland with 2 legions. I'm actually very surprised he went in there himself. The surrounding land was reported to be rich, well-watered fields, and meeting no resistance, the army took the next city upriver, also abandoned. This was refounded as Ionith, and the Emperor established his headquarters there, being much larger than Septimia and better located to dominate the surrounding countryside. The expeditionary force had yet to meet any real resistance, although the legions were constantly shadowed by mounted enemy patrols which prevented any but large scouting parties from leaving the main body of the army. One thing the Emperor sorely lacked was cavalry, due to the limited space on the transport fleet, although for the time being the battle mages made up for this with magical reconnaissance. Well, they could have put some horses there, I would think. They don't have to make up a huge cavalry force, but some for scouting. That probably would have helped. The Emperor now sent out envoys to try to contact the Saeshi king or whoever ruled this land, but his messengers never returned. See, this is where the scouting of Akavir failed. They should have made diplomatic contact before sending any force over there. They should have had perhaps an embassy, somebody to speak to the locals and report back to the Emperor so they would at least have an idea of what they're going to face if they were going to invade. In retrospect, the Commission believes that valuable time was wasted in this effort while the army was stalled at Ionith, which could have had been better spent in advancing quickly while the enemy was still, apparently, surprised by the invasion. However, the Emperor believed at the time that the Saeshi could be overawed by the Emperor's power, and he might win a province by negotiation with no need for serious fighting. Meanwhile, the 4 legions were busy building a road between Septimia and Ionith, setting up fortified guard posts along the river, and fortifying both cities' defenses, activities which would serve them well later. Due to their lack of cavalry, scouting was limited and communication between the 2 cities constantly threatened by enemy raiders, with which the legions were still unable to come to grips. The original plan had been to bring the 2 reinforcing legions across as soon as the initial landing had secured a port, But the fateful decision was now taken to delay their arrival and instead begin using the fleet to transport colonists. The Emperor and the Council agreed that, due to the complete abandonment of the conquered area by its native population, colonists were needed to work the fields so that the expeditionary force would not have to rely entirely on the fleet for supplies. In addition, unrest had broken out in, how do you pronounce this? Neslia. Yeah, Neslia or Neslia? I like Neslia. Athwart the supply route to Akavir, one of the islands, and the council believed the 9th and 17th legions would be better used in repacifying those territories and securing the expeditionary force's supply lines. See, that's all good, but they'll find out later they couldn't grow any food there. The civilian colonists and their supplies began arriving in Septimia in mid-Hearthfire, and they took over the preparation of the fields which had been started by the legionnaires for a spring crop. A number of cavalry mounts were also brought over at this time, and the raids on the 2 imperial colonies subsequently fell off. Saeshi emissaries also finally arrived at Ionith, purportedly to begin peace negotiations, and the expeditionary force settled in for what was expected to be a quiet winter. At this time, the council urged the emperor to return to Tamriel with the fleet, to deal with many pressing matters of the empire, while the army was in winter quarters, but the emperor decided that it would be best to remain in Akavir. This turned out to be fortunate because a large portion of the fleet, including the emperor's flagship, was destroyed by an early winter storm during the homeward voyage. The winter storm season of 288 to 289 was unusually prolonged and exceptionally severe, and prevented the fleet from returning to Akavir as planned with additional supplies. This was reported to the Emperor via Battlemage, and it was agreed that the expeditionary force could survive on what supplies it had on hand until the spring. Part 3. The destruction of the expeditionary force. The winter weather in Akavir was much more severe than expected. Due to the supply problems and the addition of thousands of civilians, the expeditionary force was on tight rations. To make matters worse, the Saeshi raiders returned in force and harried any foraging and scouting parties outside the walls of the 2 cities. Now, I'm wondering what the diplomats had to say about that. The several watch forts on the road between Septimia and Ionith were captured during blizzards, and the rest had to be abandoned as untenable. As a result, communication between the 2 cities had to be conducted entirely by magical means, a continuing strain on the Legion's battle mages. On Fifth Sun's dawn, a large entourage of Saeshi arrived at Ionith, claiming to bring a peace offer from the Saeshi king. That night, these treacherous envoys murdered the guards at one of the city gates and led in a strong party of their comrades who were waiting outside the city walls. Their clear intention was to assassinate the emperor, foiled only by the vigilance and courage of troopers of the 10th who were guarding his palace. Once the alarm was raised, the Saeshi inside the city were hunted down and killed to the last man. Needless to say, this was the end of the negotiations between the emperor and the Saeshi. You know what, in not any here of this book, not any place does it tell you how the Saeshi actually looked. Were they the snake men? The ones that came over here during the time of Emperor Riemann? And after, during the, after his death. Before the interregnum. I forget what that period of time was called at the moment. The arrival of spring only brought worse troubles. Instead of the expected spring rains, a hot, dry wind began to blow from the east, continuing with varying strength through the entire summer. The crops failed, and even the river, which in the previous year had been navigable by small boats far upstream of Ionith, was completely dried up by sun's height. It is unknown if this was due to a previously unknown weather pattern unique to Akavir, or if the Saeshi manipulated the weather through magical means. The Commission leans towards the former conclusion, as there is no direct evidence of the Saeshi possessing such fearsome arcane power, but the latter possibility cannot be entirely ruled out. Due to prolonged bad weather, the supply fleet was late in setting out from Black Harbor. It finally left port in early Second Seed, but was again severely mauled by storms and limped into Septimia 8 weeks later, much reduced. Because of the increasingly desperate supply situation in Akavir, the Emperor dispatched most of his battlemage corps with the fleet to assist it in weathering the storms, which seemed likely to continue all summer. At this time, the council urged the Emperor to abandon the invasion and return to Tamriel with the expeditionary force, but he again refused. noting that the fleet was no longer large enough to transport all 4 legions at once. The Commission agrees that leaving 1 or more legions behind in Akavir to await the return of the fleet would have damaged army morale, but the Commission also notes that the loss of 1 legion would have been preferable to the loss of the entire expeditionary force. It is the unanimous opinion of the Commission that this was the last point at which complete disaster might have been averted. Once the decision was made to send the fleet back for reinforcements and supplies, events proceeded to their inevitable conclusion. From this point on, much less is known about what transpired in Akavir, with most of the battle mages assisting the fleet. Communication between the expeditionary force and Tamriel was limited, especially as the situation in Akavir worsened, and the remaining battle mages had their powers stretched to the limit, attending to all the needs of the legions. However, it appears that the Seashi may also have been actively interfering with the mages in some unknown manner. Some of the mages in Akavir reported their powers being abnormally weak, and the mages of the War College in Cyrodiil, who were handling communication for their council, reported problems linking up with their compatriots in Akavir, even between master and pupil of long training. The Commission urges that the War College make a particular study of the arcane powers of the Seashi should the Empire ever come into conflict with Akavir again. This is where spies and diplomats, it's kind of synonymous, could have reported everything over there before sending out a large force to invade. What is known is that the Emperor marched out of Ionith in mid-sun's height, leaving only small garrisons to hold the cities. He had learned that the Seashi were massing their forces on the other side of a mountain range to the north, and he intended to smash their army before it could gather full strength and capture their supplies, of which he was in desperate need. This rapid advance seemed to have taken the Seashi by surprise, and the expeditionary force crossed the mountains and fell on their camp, routing the Seashi army and capturing its leader, a noble of some kind. But the Emperor was soon forced to retreat, and the legions suffered heavily on their retreat to Ionith. The Emperor now found himself besieged at Ionith, cut off from the small garrison at Septimia, which was also besieged. By this time, it seems that the efforts of the few remaining battle mages were devoted entirely to creating water to keep the army alive, a skill not normally emphasized at the War College. The fleet had arrived safely back to Black Harbor thanks to the Battle Mage Corps, but all attempts to return to Akavir were frustrated by a series of ever more savage storms that battered Estrionet throughout the rest of 289. The Council's last contact with the Emperor was in early frost fall. By evening star, the Council was extremely worried about the situation in Akavir and ordered the fleet to sail regardless of the risk. Despite the continued storms, the fleet managed to press on to Akavir. Hope was raised when contact was made with the Emperor's battle mage, who reported that Ionith still held out. Plans were quickly laid for the expeditionary force to break out of Ionith and fall back on Septimia, where the fleet would meet them. This was the last direct contact with the expeditionary force. The fleet arrived in Septimia to find its garrison under savage assault from a large Seashi army. The battle mages with the fleet threw back the enemy long enough for the survivors to embark and the fleet to withdraw. Well, at least they got some people out. Not everybody was lost. The few survivors of the expeditionary force who reached Septimia told how the Emperor had led the army out of Ionith by night 2 days earlier, successfully breaking through the enemy's lines, but then being surrounded by overwhelming forces on the road to Septimia. They told of a heroic last stand by the Emperor and the 10th Legion, which allowed a remnant of the 14th to reach Septimia. 2 survivors of the 10th arrived in Septimia that night, having slipped through the enemy lines during their undisciplined victory celebration. These men confirmed having seen the Emperor die, cut down by enemy arrows as he rallied the 10th's shield wall. Part 4. Conclusion. The Commission believes that the invasion of Akavir, which was doomed from the start for several reasons, none of which could have been foreseen beforehand, unfortunately. Despite extensive intelligence gathering, not enough if you ask me, not enough, the expeditionary force was clearly unprepared for the situation in Akavir. The unexpected weather which plagued the army and navy was particularly disastrous. Without the loss of a majority of the Far East fleet during the campaign, the expeditionary force could have been withdrawn in 289. The weather also forced the Emperor to assign most of his battle mage corps to the fleet, leaving him without their valuable assistance during the fighting, which soon followed. And of course the unexpected drought which struck Ionith during 289 dashed the hopes of supplying the army locally and left the expeditionary force in an untenable situation when besieged in Ionith. The Saeshi were also much stronger than intelligence reports suggested. Information on the size of the army the Saeshi were eventually able to field against the expeditionary force is vague, as the only serious fighting took place after regular communications were cut off between the Emperor and the Council. Nevertheless, it seems likely that the Saeshi outnumbered the Emperor's forces by several times, as they were able to force 4 crack legions into retreat and then keep them under siege for several months. As was stated previously, the Commission declines to criticize the initial decision to invade Akavir. Based on what was known at the time, the plan seemed sound. It is only with the benefit of hindsight does it become obvious that the invasion had very little chance of success. Nevertheless, the Commission believes several valuable lessons can be taken from this disaster. First, the Saeshi may have extremely powerful arcane forces at their command. The possibility that they may have manipulated the weather across such a vast region seems incredible, and it should be noted that 3 commissioners strongly objected to this paragraph even being included in this report. But the Commission believes that the matter deserves urgent investigation. The potential danger is such that even the slight possibility must be taken seriously. I agree there, actually, quite a bit. Second, the Saeshi appear to possess no navy to speak of. The expeditionary force was never threatened by sea, and the Far East fleet fought nothing but the weather. Indeed, initial plans called for a portion of the fleet to remain in Akavir for use in coastal operations, but in the event there were very few places where the large vessels of the fleet could approach the land, due to the innumerable reefs, sandbars, islands, etc., that infested the coastal waters north and south from Septimia. Due to the utter lack of trees in the plain around Septimia and Ionith, the expeditionary force was unable to build smaller vessels, which could have navigated the shallow coastal waters. Any future military expeditions against Akavir would do well to consider some way of bringing a means for inshore naval operations in order to exploit this clear advantage over the Saeshi, an advantage that was sadly unexploited by the expeditionary force. Third, much longer-term study needs to be made of Akavir before another invasion could even be contemplated. The information gathered over the 4 years prior to the invasion was extensive, but clearly inadequate. The weather conditions were completely unexpected, the Saeshi much stronger than expected, and the attempted negotiations by the Emperor with the Saeshi a disaster. Akavir proved alien beyond expectation, and the Commission believes any future attempt to invade Akavir should not be contemplated without much greater knowledge of the conditions, politics, and peoples of that continent than presently obtained. Finally, the Commission unanimously concludes that, given what we now, any attempt to invade Akavir is folly, at least in the present state of the Empire. The Empire's legions are needed at home. One day, a peaceful, united Empire will return to Akavir and exact severe retribution for the disaster at Ionith and for our fallen Emperor. But that day is not now, nor in the foreseeable future. Yes, they needed a lot more intelligence on the region. They need to know what the Saeshi were capable of if they really were using magic to cause all those storms and the drought. But you know what? It's kind of telling to me that they arrived at these 2 places. Did they create Ionith, or was it a small town that renamed it? But regardless, these 2 areas had no crops. There was no extensive areas that were used for growing food by the Saeshi, so that's got to tell you something. Maybe that area just was prone to droughts. Maybe it was a dry land, kind of like Hammerfell. There's so many questions, and this is the most extensive actual report of what it's like over there, but it doesn't describe the people over there, not at all. It just refers to them as the Saeshi. I really wish it explained what they look like, told what they look like. Were they like us, or were they the Snake Men? I guess we'll have to return to Akavir to find out someday. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.